computer. And so I like to because my introduction of the speaker often tells things that her husband told me, that it's not going to be in her introduction. Or maybe her mother in this case, because I now met her mother. I'm just teasing you, of course. We welcome Elise Hooper, who has presented to this group before about her book, The Other Alcott. Did any of you see it that night? Yeah. Elise works in historical fiction, has lived in West Seattle since moving to the Pacific Northwest in 2001, and in fact her first apartment in Seattle was almost right next door to the Log House Museum.
That's true.
Although a New Englander by birth and at heart, she says, Elise now lives with her husband and 2 young daughters within stone-skipping distance of the Pacific Northwest Puget Sound. When she's not writing, she's in her classroom making American history and literature interesting for high school students. But she told us tonight she's taking a little sabbatical.
I know, I need to update that on my blog.
Something like that. All right. Elise grew up in New England, as I indicated, as a bona fide bookworm. I guess her mom will probably attest to that. She says her love of reading, paired with an overly active imagination, led her to believe she was born in the wrong era. Instead of living in the 80s, she thought she was supposed to be traveling across the prairie in a covered wagon, chasing fawns through Narnia, or exploring Prince Edward Island in puffed sleeves. Instead, she crossed town in a station wagon to chase field hockey balls and wore tree horns to explore the mall, all while dreaming of leading a more storied existence somewhere like Thornfield Hall, Mandalay, or Tara. Research is one of Elise's favorite activities, and she says she enjoys all the time she spends learning about unusual things. She also loves being able to put her vivid imagination to work on productive things instead of worrying about crazy scenarios that she concocts in her own head. After eventually moving to the West Coast and attending graduate school, Elise started teaching high school English and history and writing whenever she had the chance. Her main characters tend to be based on the lives of real women who have been frequently overlooked in history books. Many of these women, like May Alcott and Dorothea Lang, can help us better understand the past and draw important connections to our own times. Please help me welcome Elise to our new Words Writers in Southwest Stories.
Yeah, thank you. I have a little timer here so I don't keep you all night. Because I can talk all night, as my old students would attest. Thanks so much for coming tonight and skipping the debate. And I think it's wine walk, like wine and art walk. That's up at the right. Junction. Yeah. So I really am grateful to you. I feel like I need to pull out something very exciting here to make it all worth it. But it's great to be here at the library. I think this is such a beautiful branch. We're really lucky here in West Seattle to have a bunch of beautiful branches. So here I am to talk about Dorothea Lange, who is probably best known for this photo. This is one that has been on postage stamps, many memes. I'll kind of even walk around with it. This is her most famous photo, Migrant Mother, and I'll talk a little more about the context for the photo. It's Dorothea Lang who's on the cover there, and I'll talk a little more about the cover of the book too, because unlike the other Alcott, this one, we worked a little harder to get this cover right. So this is a novel, which means it is, I have made up conversations in this book. I've really sort of imagined characters, but it is based on the life of a real person. And so that's called biographical fiction. And I think I've gotten kind of lucky recently in the fact that there's a great example of biographical fiction out there when people are sort of confused about what that is exactly. And it really is our friend, Mr. Hamilton. There's Ron Chernow's biography, which is a cradle-to-grave accounting of Alexander Hamilton's life. And then there is the fun musical, which is so entertaining and I highly recommend seeing, which is this wonderful storytelling, and it is based on history, but nevertheless, Lin-Manuel Miranda did make some changes to Alexander's life to make it entertaining. Clearly they weren't all singing, he took it to a whole new level. Unfortunately, I have no hip-hop background. You don't want to see me singing and dancing. But this is like the gold standard, in my opinion, in many ways, of what sort of biographical fiction can be. And so, but yeah, so I'm here to talk about Dorothea Lange and this famous photo she took. It's kind of an interesting story about it in the sense that this is really the image everyone knows. When I was working on this novel and I would say, I'm working on a book about Dorothea Lange, I tended to get really blank stares until I pull up my phone and bring up this photo. And then, of course, yeah, everyone nods their head. And I really thought it was important to try to shed some light into Dorothea's life because she led this fascinating existence of her own that I think really gives us a great look into women's lives in the 20s and 30s and really beyond. I mean, the Great Depression, the World War II, it's just a fascinating period in American history where so much changes in our country. She provides a great lens at which to look at this period through. When I started thinking about Dorothea, I had used her work many years when I was teaching American history. I would use it when I was teaching the Great Depression, the Grapes of Wrath. And so I used all of her work but never really known anything, I'm embarrassed to say, kind of about her. And I was led to her through the work of another woman photographer named Imogen Cunningham. Yeah, so Imogen actually spent some time in Seattle. She went to the University of Washington. And I really wanted to work on kind of a local figure for this book. But then as I started researching Imogen, who is fascinating in her own right, I then kind of re-encountered Dorothea, this woman whose work I had used for teaching for all these years, and I became captivated and kind of found myself pivoting and doing more with her. So, and so as I dove into her life, what I really encountered was this fascinating transformation. And that's really what interested me from a writer's point of view. I mean, we have a woman who in the 1920s is producing studio photography that looks like this, kind of these dreamy photographs of really San Francisco's, and feel free to take a, those seats are great. Taking these sort of dreamy photos of San Francisco's well-heeled, essentially kind of just its wealthy population. And then 20 years later, she's taking pretty subversive photos in the Japanese internment camps throughout California. I wanted to understand Dorothea's journey. What led her from turning into taking kind of these really sort of high society photos into becoming a real sort of firecracker and thinking about social justice. That was the quest that I sought to understand better. And so when I'm writing about a real person, it's really important for me to understand what I call their sort of ghosts. And these are the things that shaped these figures, be it May Alcott, Dorothea Lange, the book I'm working on now that I'll tell you about in a few minutes. And so I go back into their youth. So this is a picture of Dorothea and her younger brother Martin, and this is Dorothea in about the early 20s. Dorothea grew up in Hoboken, New Jersey, went to high school in New York City, but she eventually moves to California when she's about 22 years old. And so when I went back into her childhood to kind of understand what created maybe this transformation in this woman, I was struck by two things that really, I think, explain a lot about her. And I'm not giving anything away. Both of these are in the first few pages of the novel, and then one actually never makes it into the novel. So I always enjoy telling readers about this. So the first experience I think really shaped Dorothea was that at the age of 7, she contracted polio and spent several feverish weeks kind of fighting to survive. And when the fever had passed, she ended up with a withered foot. Her leg never really functioned, normally, as you would say, again. And this really left Dorothea, I think, with a profound sense of feeling like she didn't fit in. In fact, she would describe experiences as a child where her mother especially would kind of pull her aside a little to make room for other kids, and she always felt like all of her neighbors looked at her, sort of gave her some side eye, not sure of she felt like she was an example of contagion. And that really gave her a sense of, I think, compassion toward other people she saw as maybe feeling like they didn't fit in either. Also, later in life, as she was out in the fields of California and beyond, photographing migrant workers, many of the people she photographed reported that Dorothea was very approachable. She would come up and start gently talking to people. She would explain who she was and that she was working for the government to take pictures, to try to draw help to the plight of migrant workers. And she never hid anything. She wasn't sensational. She just kind of explained who she was. And people often said, too, that they kind of saw something of themselves in her, in that they saw her walk toward them with a limp, and they immediately were sort of drawn to the approachability of that. So I think that experience really made Dorothea sensitive and empathetic to people who maybe didn't feel like they were easily sort of winning the American dream that was being promised, especially loudly in the 1930s and beyond. So there was that. The other thing that really affected Dorothea was that her father, one day when she was 12 years old, walked out their front door and never returned. And Dorothea never knew what became of him. Her father's whereabouts were always a mystery to her. And what is so interesting about this, and this never makes it into the novel just because I couldn't figure out how to work it in, but Dorothea's father, she keeps this kind of secret her whole life, that her father had disappeared. And it turns out that her mother had maintained contact with him all of those years. And Dorothea never even knew this. And what had happened was Dorothea's biographer, eventually upon her death in 1965, he went to Dorothea's second husband. He said, I'm going to figure out what happened to Dorothea's father. And the second husband, who was really Dorothea's soulmate, Paul Taylor, was like, I don't know what you're talking about. Her father, what do you mean? So she had never even told her own, this husband who she had this, this real connection, this real meeting of the mind. She never told him about one of the most sort of painful experiences of her life. And it turned out what the biographer turned over is that the father had stolen some money, and it may have been sort of embezzlement, but basically to clear his family, he decided he needed to disappear and allow his family kind of a fresh start. And because of divorce laws being what they were at the time, Dorothea's mother had to pretend to the world that she had been abandoned, that she had no idea what had happened to her, because that's really the only way a woman could get divorced in this period. But as a result of that, she never even told her own children that their father had left for these reasons and that he was now in Chicago. She kept all of that secret. And this is interesting to me on so many levels. First of all, because I think this really left, again, Dorothea with a profound sense of abandonment, of feeling a bit unlovable. I think she even connected the two, this having had this injury as a child, to possibly being why her father had left her. And because she saw it as leaving her, of course, at that age, right? Not leaving the family. She didn't really understand that at all. But she carried this wound inside her for the rest of her life, never spoke of it. And it really wasn't until this biographer figured all of this out that it kind of came to light. And her second husband was even shocked by it. And so knowledge of those two events really guided much of my sort of development of this woman, of someone who was very sensitive to other people who were maybe experiencing pain or were struggling. I think she very much was sensitive to that, and it left her with trying to right some wrongs. If she could help other people out, that was somehow getting her a little closer to solving maybe the pain she carried. So those were two things that were so interesting to me in this story. And then the other thing I like to do when I'm talking to audiences is always talk about a little bit more, again, about Migrant Mother, this famous photo. There I have it as a postage stamp. But I always like to point out the wider shot. Dorothea took this photo having no idea that this would be the photo that really defined her career. She'd been down in Southern California photographing some agricultural migrant workers, was driving up to her home in Berkeley, kind of trying to beat the rain. It was pouring on this drive. And she passed this little handwritten sign on the side of the street in Nipomo, California, saying Pea Pickers Camp. And she just kept flooring it, foot to the pedal, wanting to get home. But after a couple miles, that sign was kind of nagging at her. The rain was coming down in sheets. And she turned around and she went back to this camp. And she found this woman, along with some other families. The waters were rising. They had no food. Dorothea she was there. She took about well, I'm not exactly sure how many photos she took, but she was there for like 10, 15 minutes. She was not there for long. She did ask people to kind of move around a little. She wasn't someone who just photographed people as is. But she was trying to capture the dire circumstances of what she discovered. And for one thing, this woman, Florence, in the photograph is 32 years old. I always want to draw attention to that because she ends up having 11 children. I think she had about 6 or 7 at this point. But I mean, Florence herself had a very difficult life. But then, I mean, look at the wider shot. What we've actually, sort of the image we know that's been passed down to us all these decades has really been sanitized considerably. This was a photo Dorothea took for the government. The government owned this photo. Dorothea never made any money, really to speak of, beyond her salary as a staff photographer for the FSA from this photo. Florence never made any money from the photo. But I've always found it amazing that the government, like that this photo that looks grim enough to us is actually a much better version of truly what we see here with the garbage, the tattered tent they were living in. And this is just such a little symbol of kind of how Dorothea worked, the kind of photos she took. She took pretty hard-hitting photos for the government. And the government actually, the photos they often used were the pretty cleaned up photos. And that always irked Dorothea. She wanted people to see how much people were struggling, especially women and children, who had very little recourse for their lives. So this photo, while iconic and everything, I always want to alert people to actually kind of the rest of the series, because Dorothea raced up after taking these photos to Berkeley, developed it very quickly, actually jumped on the ferry, because at that point there was no Bay Bridge yet, with even the wet photography paper, hurried over into San Francisco, and an editor, maybe at the San Francisco Chronicle, I'm not sure my newspaper there is right, but took the photos, put them out on the AP, and helped relief workers did show up at this camp and provided more sort of housing in the sense of better tarps and things like that, and more specifically more food. Yeah.
Did she do the crop?
I'm actually not sure, but the photo has been changed and it's developed so many times over the years. I don't know what her original looked like.
Yeah,
Yeah, because it has been changed. I mean, the government has since reprinted it so many times, so that's a good question. Yeah.
Do you, not that you know, but what do you think that she would have said to that family when she walked up, and would she have by any chance had any money to give to them?
Dorothea was all business, so she didn't, to the best of my knowledge, ever offer money to people. And I think that was largely out of principle, because she didn't want, she first of all was in fairly dire circumstances herself, which is why she had taken a job that took her away from her own family. And the salary she was making from the government was quite small. She was of course making a lot less than all the male photographers on staff. But Dorothea, this was what she did all day long. So if she gave money to one I don't know how she could have maintained that. So to the best of my knowledge, she never gave money to anyone. And from what I know of what she said, she came right up, she introduced herself, said she was a staff photographer for the FSA, was going to try to take images that would alert people to the dire circumstances of migrant workers in the area. And she then actually felt like her skills in lighting people in the rain wasn't very good, so she actually asked them to move a little better for lighting. She asked the children, as you can see, to look away from the camera. She felt like the 3 faces looking in felt a little too much, so she actually wanted those children to be turning away. So she did play a little with the composition, which is something, people are always interested in that too, like how staged were her photos. They weren't exactly staged, but Dorothea didn't just sort of necessarily take a photo exactly of people as they were when she arrived. Yeah.
One more question. Maybe I missed. FSA stands for the Federal...
The Farm Securities Administration.
Oh, farm.
Yeah, and it was also the RA at one point, which is the Relocation Agency or Administration. So with FDR's sort of constantly evolving alphabet soup, the name of her agency changed a few times. But basically, she was in a pool of photographers that would take images of migrant agricultural workers, also workers in factories, and she was the only one really out here in the West. The rest were all East Coast based. And their whole mission was to document what was happening in the country, and those photos would be made available to news agencies to use. So her work, for example, accompanied John Steinbeck's series of articles that were the start of the Grapes of Wrath, known as the Harvest Gypsies. Her work accompanied his in some of his early journalistic endeavors. So her work was widely circulated at the time, and interestingly enough, I mean, I began this novel in 2015-ish. It really changed after the presidential election of 2016. I mean, the whole tenor was suddenly migrant families in the news and internment camps. The whole sort of nature of Dorothea's story has become startlingly relevant again today.
I was just going to volunteer that you're making me think of that, except we have social workers and so forth, and they did not.
They did have some social workers at the time. In fact, Dorothea's mother worked as a social worker in Hoboken back in the day.
Wow.
Yeah, so there were social workers. I mean, this was a time of such extreme need in the country that, I mean, the system was overburdened. But Dorothea, yeah, I mean, so there were social workers, and her work found its way not only into newspapers, but also into government reports. In fact, that's how she met her second husband. He was an economist producing reports to go to the government about how to better serve migrants flooding into California. He thought, at that point, only from Mexico. At that point, the Dust Bowl. I mean, it's so interesting. Now we live in an era where news comes at us from every direction. We can try to assemble what the whole world is experiencing. Back then, it took them a while to connect what was happening in the middle of the country with the Dust Bowl with suddenly masses of people arriving in California. It took a while to connect all those dots.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Good parallel.
And then I have a couple of images that also just give some insight into how Dorothea viewed the world and what she saw the purpose of her work, and sometimes what the government did with it, because the aims were not always all the same. And so Dorothea is best known for her work from California, but she did travel all over the country taking photographs. And she developed a particular interest in these rural gas stations that could be found throughout the South. And she found them to be just amazing microcosms of Southern society. The poverty, the sort of ramshackle nature of these places, the fact that during the day, all day long, men were just hanging out at these, not working. I mean, she thought that was interesting. Racial tensions were always interesting to her at these. And so she took a series of these photographs. We have kind of like a men's sort of amateur league baseball team who's met up at this gas station. You can see on the corner there's an African-American man kind of minding his own business. Dorothea always tried to capture race elements, and she tried to use the physicality and how people were sitting as a way to kind of read that dynamic exactly of how people were. So she sent these images into the government agency. Well, this is what the government did with it. It turned it into propaganda posters. It says, "This is America, where a fella can start on the home team and wind up in the big league, where there is always room at the top for the fellow who has it on the ball. This is your America, keep it free." That was really different from what Dorothea was trying to portray in these images. So she ends up, especially as the war is winding, I mean, she was a real New Dealer, like 100% New Dealer, believed that government's role was to help people. And at the end of World War II, the New Deal was just dust in the minds of most people. I mean, it had really moved on to being about the Cold War and this new emerging American power in the world. And Dorothea felt very out of sync with what was then happening. So this period of Dorothea's life, my novel covers her arrival in San Francisco in 1922, and then, 1923 actually, sorry. And it really then goes through the beginning of World War II and her coverage of internment camps. I specifically, while her life after the war is interesting and she does some really interesting projects, I felt like this was the period where we really see that transformation, where she becomes awakened to events outside of her kind of fancy portrait studio. She sees the bread lines spreading down the sidewalks of San Francisco, and she realized that that's where she wanted to focus. She wanted to understand that better, and she wanted to capture that better. And journey is so interesting, obviously because of world events right now, and domestic events specifically, but also because Dorothea was working at a time where she was the primary breadwinner for her family. Her husband, who I'll talk about in a minute, Maynard Dixon, her first husband, he was not really earning a lot of money. Dorothea was, and, well, maybe not a lot of money, that's a stretch, but Dorothea was earning enough money to keep them afloat for a while. They had 2 children. This was not an era where you could sign your kids up for the local daycare or anything. So Dorothea has to make some choices about how she's going to balance her work life and her family life, and made those choices in a way that to modern readers is pretty astonishing. She had to make difficult choices that history has judged her harshly in many ways for over the years. And I really wanted to understand those choices better and what had gone into what she had sacrificed, what she had lost, and if she had gained anything through this journey of hers. So that is something that was interesting for me to work on, and when I've met with book clubs is always a big discussion of how Dorothea did all of this. So it's been kind of a fun one to talk about, especially with book clubs. But the other thing I'll just do today is just take you through a couple more of my favorite photos of Dorothea's, because while at the end of the novel, so much of her work that she did for the government is in the public domain, so we could use some of the photos at the end. There are a few that weren't that I really like to show, so I could use them in presentations. I couldn't put them in the book. But Dorothea was a real master at kind of irony and showing, using kind of what was happening in signage and marketing versus real life. She was a real master at that. And I mean, we can see the photo here on your left with the hobos walking along a highway with the train billboard alongside it saying, "Next time, take the train and relax." And Dorothea was like, this is not the life that most Americans are living right now. Also, this one, I love this photo. It was taken in Richmond, California, which at the start of World War II, well, throughout World War II, was a real factory town. This was a city that really kicked into gear as the American war machine got going. It was producing war materials, ships, everything. And it became a city that was so packed with workers, they had hotbeds. Does anyone know what a hotbed is? Sounds kind of racy. Well, basically, when you have constant shifts of workers coming to town, why would you just rent a room to someone for 24 hours when you can actually rent it in 12-hour shifts and have someone sleeping in that bed around the clock? And hopefully they were changing the linens, but I don't know. And so Richmond attracted all of these workers who were, wanted wages, and it attracted a pretty diverse worker population of men and women, African Americans, whites. And for an African American woman, factory work was a great job, because for most African American women in this country in this era, and actually even for decades to come, working as a domestic in someone's house was the sort of most common form of work. And that is a tough route to work in, because you don't have a whole lot of control over your life. Benefits were non-existent. You were kind of at the mercy of your employer. Whereas a factory job, while factory workers often have their own challenges, at the time this was really a novel way to work, to kind of make your own salary, have a contract that you were filling on. This was considered desirable. And so I think that Dorothea must have loved the moment. I've never heard her talk about this photograph, that she could capture this woman clearly on her way to her factory job with the "Serve Yourself" sign in the background. I just thought that was really clever. It shows her sharp eye. Yeah. Shall I go back?
In 1920, you said were black people allowed to drink water and eat in the factories?
Well, so this is World War II at this point, so it's 43, and it is California. So
that's right, but still,
it depended. Yeah, I mean, there were definitely some segregated conditions for sure in factories. Richmond, I think, wasn't as segregated as most places, but I'm sure that there was racial tension simmering in these factories. And I'm sure she didn't make enough, make as much as clearly men or white people. I mean, salaries were still subject to a considerable variance.
That's good picture.
Yeah, of course. The other photos I'll show you here are some of her internment work. Dorothea was really interested. She was horrified by what was happening with the internment camps, and only took the job offered to her hoping to show people what was happening, the injustice that was underway. And so she tried to play with shadow and things like that to kind of look like jail bars. And she did these things, and eventually the government could see it, and so they fired her and impounded her photos. And the person they brought in to photograph, anyone know?
Ansel Adams.
Exactly, Ansel Adams. And so this is Ansel Adams photographed on the left. And just look, I mean, Dorothea is really paying attention here to the people. Ansel strolled into this job much more interested in showing the stark beauty of Manzanar and the sky and kind of dwarfing these little barracks that the people were forced to live in. He had no interest in showing injustice. He was interested in the texture and the lighting, and Dorothea never really forgave him for that. That was always a real tension between them. They were friends, kind of frenemies more in many ways. But she never forgave him for what she saw was an opportunity to try to alert people to what was happening. Ansel had no issue, really, with what was happening. In fact, when Dorothea had the job, she had very stringent rules placed upon her. No photographing barbed wire, guns, dogs, nothing that would make this look like a concentration camp. Ansel was able to go up into the watchtower, the guards' towers to photograph because he was completely compliant, hanging out with these guys, no problem. So really different approaches to this, and I think it's pretty fascinating because Ansel was on the wrong side of history on this, for sure. I mean, he had no objection to what was happening, and I think, try walking into a doctor's office in this country right now, and there's always at least one Ansel Adams photograph, right? I mean, he's kind of the famous photograph, whereas Dorothea, who even in the 40s could kind of see what was happening, she is the figure we don't really know as well. I've always thought that was really interesting. And now I'll give just a little brief view into Dorothea's first husband, Maynard Dixon. Does anyone know who Maynard Dixon is? I saw some heads nodding, yeah. I really became enchanted by Maynard Dixon's. His work is amazing. I have a couple of his paintings here. This was a photograph Dorothea took of him on the left in his studio in San Francisco. He was obsessed with the West. He had this really romantic vision. In fact, when Dorothea met him, he showed up in an all-black outfit, black cowboy boots, a black hat, a black cape,
Whoa.
and a cane. And sort of this like cowboy superhero figure. He was a very colorful figure in San Francisco, and kind of for a good reason. He was profane. He was much older than her. He was about 20 years older. They were a really interesting pairing, but nevertheless, as this sort of 23-year-old that she was when she met him, maybe 24, she was captivated because he was so interesting. He took her out camping. He took her into this big West that she had never really experienced, and she, fell in love. But this was not always going to work out, clearly, for a bunch of different reasons. But nevertheless, I just was so captivated by Maynard's work. I mean, he creates these big, beautiful paintings through the 20s especially. His work really stopped selling pretty much overnight in 1929 when the Great Depression strikes. No one was collecting fine art at this point. And so he continued to paint though, which is why he wasn't really watching their children. And his work just stopped selling. And so no one really, he's kind of a figure who's lost today in sort of American art history. A lot of people, when I talk about him, have never heard of him. And I've kind of developed a theory that I think it's because essentially what happens to his work is that, guess what group scoops it up for song in the late 30s? The Mormons. The Church of Latter-day Saints, great historians of the American West, right? They buy up this huge collection of his for a song. It's all at Brigham Young. It rarely comes on the market now. So I think the fact that his work rarely goes to auction or anything has really kind of reduced his visibility. You can occasionally find little segments on Antique Roadshow where someone shows up with this painting we found in the attic, and it's a Maynard Dixon. And the producers, you can always tell, are really excited because they're there's a huge range they always give to the value of his work.
I swear there's one of these is in the Fonda. This is so familiar.
Oh, really?
It's got a blue tint.
Yeah, okay. Maybe, yeah.
So
But there is not much of his work.
She and I, we knew who he was. So
Yeah. His work is beautiful. I highly recommend Googling and looking around. I have some more images because Dorothea kind of ends up as like a brief footnote in his whole story. But really she did, you can see how her work impacted him. I mean, look at those big, beautiful paintings he was doing in the West. He then does what he called his Forgotten Man series in the 30s. That I think there are clear parallels here, right? Between she is influencing his paintings. And this too is work that the Brigham Young now has in their collection. And so I think it's really, he marries a third time after her, and that third wife really went about setting his legacy, created the foundation that now kind of carries on his vision. And I think understandably kind of Dorothea is a really small piece of his story, where I always like to just point out that her influence on him is very significant, and definitely changed his work forever. Let's see what else. Oh yeah, okay. Let's see the things. This was the first. I'll give you a little background into the first cover of this book, which was sent to me, and it was lovely. And my editor didn't love the hands. She thought they looked kind of weird. And we were all kind of like, yeah, I mean, it's pretty. Doesn't really speak to Dorothea. And fortunately, the sales team apparently hadn't seen this yet. And they had all watched this great documentary that I highly recommend watching. You can Google it. I think it can be found on Amazon Prime right now. It's called Grab a Hunk of Lightning. It's in the back of the book, too. I make a mention of it in my sources section. But they had the sales team at HarperCollins had just watched that documentary, and they were like, no, this is not her at all. We need her wearing pants and kind of looking like the revolutionary that she is. So then we went to this photo. The old car was kind of cool and stuff. But the camera that's there on her lap looked a bit like a bag of groceries. And so that wasn't quite right. And so then I decided I was really going to make a case for the cover that we now have, which this is a photo that Paul Taylor, Dorothea's second husband, took of her. I liked it standing on the car. You can see her with her pants. That is clearly, well, maybe not a camera you'd use today, a camera. It worked with the title. That one spoke to me. So we had to get permissions to use this photograph. It is in private collection down at the Oakland Museum of California. And it was summer. It took a while to get permissions. That was kind of a
Do you know what the date is on that?
My guess is it's about 36, 37. I don't know exactly. I could find that out.
No, I'm just intrigued because it's the same time O'Keefe
Yes.
buys, I think, the identical car, and partially because of those open doors.
Yeah.
You can open the doors,
Yeah.
and there's some pictures of her painting in the car in the
Right.
heat of the day with her easel set up in the back seat.
Yeah.
So I just thought, how interesting is this
They're contemporaries and
Yeah.
and actually Imogen's work looks a lot at times like Georgia O'Keeffe's, the close-up photograph flowers. Yeah, exactly.
I can't remember if there's a connection.
Yeah.
I like the color of your cover too. It's more reflective of the times.
Yeah. I think my publisher did a great job with it. But it is always a little nerve-wracking to go through a few covers. I got really lucky with the other Alcott where we just kind of got that one right away. And I'll just end it, and then I can take some questions with what I'm working on now, which is a book that will be out next June called Fast Girls, which is about some trailblazing women Olympians, just in time for the Olympics next summer in Tokyo. So these women overcome, like Helen Stevens, who's sitting over there with Jesse Owens. She was the Fulton Flash from Missouri. We have Betty Robinson, a woman out of Chicago, and Louise Stokes here with her younger sister. Louise was the Malden Meteor out of Massachusetts. And these three women come together to race in Hitler's 1936 Berlin Games. So finally, I mean, you know about the boys in the boat, Louise Zamperini of Unbroken, these wonderful stories. Well, there were women there too. And their story, this book has been really fun to work on. I'm really excited. And it'll be out, I think, June 9th or 10th, whichever is a Tuesday.
Should we sign you up to present?
Oh, sure.
Maybe,
Yeah. Well, after the book is out, probably.
Oh, all right, okay.
Yeah, so I'm happy to take some questions.
Yeah, so I've been curious, when was your book published and relative to the publication of Mary Coyne, and how did Mary Coyne kind of, I don't know.
Yeah.
What was that like for you to have?
So Mary Coyne was out well before my book.
Uh-huh.
My book came out last January, and I don't know the actual date on Mary Coyne. And to be honest, I know of Mary Coyne, I haven't read the book.
Oh, you haven't read
I
it?
didn't want to read it. I knew it was fiction, so I didn't feel like from a research
Right.
perspective I needed to. And I didn't want to be influenced then. I didn't want to like subconsciously steal any of her imagery or something. I need to read it now. I should do that.
This is
Were you
another,
concerned at all that, oh, two books that were similar in some ways?
Yeah, although Mary Coyne, I think Dorothea is kind of, my understanding is she's a kind of a secondary character. It really
The main
focuses on
character
Florence,
is that
right?
Florence,
The
yeah.
woman in Migrant Mother. It
Right.
focuses on this
Right.
woman. So I actually kind of think that critical mass around a topic is a great thing. So having a few books
Uh-huh.
coming out around a similar window of time is great. It
But
adds to
some
the
of these
discussion.
biographies.
Yeah.
Like presidents from the past, you'll see
Right.
kind of a flurry of books.
Yeah, yeah.
Each one has its own kind of angle
Right,
on it. Makes it
right.
interesting to read more.
Absolutely. And so Mary Coyne came out definitely a few years before. So I really wasn't worried about it. There's another really great book that came out a couple weeks after mine about Lee Miller, another photographer. So if anything, that was kind of right around the time of mine. That's called The Age of Light. That may have come out in February. And it focuses on Lee Miller's relationship with Man Ray and while she's living in Paris. So very different. Although those two, Dorothea and Lee Miller, I think maybe Lee is about 10 years younger or something than Dorothea. But also sort of these early women photographers. Lee Miller photographed World War II. She was one of the first women as a war correspondent. Whereas Dorothea was photographing the war, but in a different way, sort of the domestic impact of it. So
I have just one other follow-up
Yeah.
question that has nothing to do with my first question, which is I'd love to hear your choice of the title for your book and what thought went into that. And
Yeah.
Yeah. How
Right.
you looked at that title.
Well, so a book I loved that I'm looking back at you because you had brought up George O'Keeffe. Have you read Georgia by Don Tripp? It's a lovely novel, and it's about George O'Keeffe. It's biographical fiction about,
I don't.
yeah, it's a great book. It's probably downstairs, about George O'Keeffe. And I read that one a few times and kind of studied it. I mean, very different lives, but that one is called Georgia. And so for a long time I was calling this book Lang. But eventually my publisher was like, yeah, no, that's not what we're gonna call it. And so I had to basically come up with a list of things. And the title, it didn't take that long. Like the other Alcott, I have to say I knew that title almost before I started writing the novel. Fast Girls, I knew that title so easily too. Learning to See did take a little bit. And really what I discovered in interviews with Dorothea when she would talk about her grandchildren, I should back up and say, and I've kind of alluded to this a little bit, Dorothea had a very complicated relationship with her own children because of these difficult choices she had to make while she was working and trying to support her family. And so, as a result, her relationship with her grandchildren was largely seen by everyone as very positive. She was, in some ways, maybe trying to make up for some of what she missed with her grandchildren. And what her grandchildren often reported saying in interviews about their grandmother was that she would always talk about learning to see. That seeing it's something we just take for granted. And she would always say, are you really seeing that? Are you learning to see? Are you paying attention? And that just kind of jumped right out at me because I think Dorothea really was learning to see over the course of her whole life. I talked about her foot that she had, that changed after polio. And at the endish of her life, she was teaching in California, and she had an assignment called Home, and she told the kids, they were, adult, like art students, take a photograph of home, and she would always do her own assignments. And she actually ended up photographing that foot of hers that for decades had sort of plagued her because she had felt like she was starting to make peace with it. And so I think that's another example of sort of her learning, her evolution of how she was learning to see. And so that's kind of where the title comes from. I mean, I've had this is what's fun about releasing a book, right? You have kind of your own angle, your own idea, and then readers bring whole new things. And a lot of readers have said, well, and then her children are learning to see differently in Maynard, and I've said, yeah, great, yes, I was thinking of all of that. But yeah, so it was, I guess, general in a sense that it could cover a lot of us as readers even learning to see things. I mean, I feel like whenever I leave a museum or read about artists, I always leave looking at things a little differently. So, I mean, that's the desire, I guess, of anyone who produces creative work. They listen or watch things or a little differently. So,
But even the photographs of the migrants and so forth helped us.
yes,
Help us currently.
absolutely.
To learn to see
Yes.
what was going on.
Yeah, yeah. So it felt a little specific. It was taken from the language of her family, but then it could kind of stretch out into.
Yeah, I like
Other-
that.
Thank you.
Just as a by the way, if you ever read Mary Coyne.
Yes, I will.
Interestingly, well, it's up to you, of course, but seeing was a prominent
Oh,
theme
great,
in that
okay.
book as well.
Oh,
So I was
okay.
kind of intrigued
I
with
know,
your
I-
picking up on
yeah.
that as well.
Okay. I gotta put it on my read list right now at the library. Any other questions?
I'm sure they'll think of them.
Oh, I should say one more thing. I said I had news when I got here.
Oh,
Well, we
yeah.
did just sell the screenplay option for this.
Oh.
An actress and writer from This Is Us, the hit show on NBC,
Huh.
is going to be writing a pilot and hoping to turn it into like a 4 or 5 part series that would hopefully Amazon, Netflix, someone like that will pick up. And the MoMA is under a great deal of renovation right now. When they reopen in the winter, they're opening with a big Dorothea Lange retrospective from like February till May. So suddenly Dorothea hopefully is going to be enjoying kind of a larger sort of reinterest from the public. So
Mama, where?
keep your fingers crossed on the show.
New York or San
Modern art.
Francisco?
That'll be in New York, the MoMA in New York, which is where she had a big show in her, when that she worked toward while she was alive. She didn't live to see it, but. Yeah.
Well, let's
Oh,
thank
what, I
her.
think I have one more question here.
Oh,
So,
okay, excuse me.
since your initial impulse was to write about Imogen Cunningham, did you have source material about their friendship?
Yes, they became best friends. Imogen really